Let's come back to the First Bank story. It's no longer news that they walked away from Oceanic. But the big question that many ask is, what exactly was First Bank looking for in this transaction? Because it's already such a huge bank, well over 600 branches. Oceanic, obviously, similarly, very large bank. What is the attraction to Oceanic for a First Bank?
I think First Bank was looking at acquiring some accounts, especially because Oceanic was known for its commercial banking, and it had a lot of commercial banking prowess in the market. I think that's what First Bank were looking at. I don't think they were looking at the branch network or the systems or the reach of Oceanic. I think that's where the disconnect with the Oceanic Bank in terms of valuation came into effect, because First Bank knew what they wanted to pay for.
And then what are the options for Oceanic Bank right now? Obviously, if First Bank walks away, what next for them?
I think in terms of Oceanic, there should be a reserve bidder. So I think they might probably go to the reserve bidder and see if they can come to an agreement there. If they can't come to an agreement with the reserve bidder, then it's up to the CBN to decide what to do.
And then there's a sense that this process has actually dragged for quite a while. August 2009 is 20 months away. That's when the central bank initially went into these banks and intervened and took over management, etc. What is the way forward? Because there's a sense that this issue is just dragging. Is it a question of going past these elections and then we might see some speed and traction on these transactions?
The whole process has been very political from the start because of the size of these banks and some of the personalities involved, and that slowed down the process. I think in terms of what the process has dragged on, I think trying to sell 7 banks, three of them, some of the top 6 banks before the CBN intervention in the market is always going to be difficult in any country. I think the fact the process has reached this stage is testament to the CBN's advisors and also the bank boards that have pushed this through. Now, this is the most difficult part, actually agreeing valuation, agreeing price, and getting shareholders to agree. And that is always going to be the most difficult part. But it needs to be done because at the moment, the banking market is a bit artificial because you have this CBN guarantee. Now, until that CBN guarantee is lifted, we're not really going to know the true state of the Nigerian banking sector. In that sense, because a lot of the interbank market is protected by the CBN guarantee. Lost this rescued bank, the depositors are still there, because of this implicit CBN guarantee. Are they going to still be there after the guarantee goes? No one knows. Until that guarantee is gone and the market is running by itself before we know the true state of the Nigerian banking market.
We've only heard about 3 memoranda of understanding so far, AfriBank, Union Bank, and of course Intercontinental Bank. We've heard of interest in that regard. But of all these, we've only seen one other bank, which is Access Bank, looking to acquire one of the rescued banks. Do you think it's likely we would see other Nigerian banks come to the fore when we hear the other announcements from the other banks that haven't announced yet?
I think the main issue is that in terms of merger, from this regulatory point of view, it's easier if it's a bank acquiring one of these banks because they already have structures in place, they're already under CBN regulatory oversight, and it's easier to merge them together from a regulatory framework. I think from the banks, the rescue banks themselves, the valuation they'll get from an existing bank is less than they will get from a new entrant in the market. Because the existing bank has its own branch network, has its own IT systems, has its own client base. And so it will only value something that's additive to what they already have. And so they will pick and choose, and that will lead to the valuation. While a private equity or a new group will value probably the whole branch network because they don't have one already. I think that's really the issue. So you probably see the bank boards, the rescue banks, leaning more towards non-banks, while CBN will probably be pushing banks to do the mergers. So I think that's really the conflict we're seeing.
And finally, let's talk about the case for another bank acquiring one of the rescued banks in the Nigerian context. The market has been somewhat quiet over the last 1 year. We've seen private sector credit moderate in terms of growth, and there's a sense that the banking sector generally has slowed down. But then if we now begin to consider some banks acquiring other banks, obviously with the risks involved in a merger, what's your take on the sensibility of such transactions right now?
Well, it all depends on the bank management of the acquiring bank, because it can be argued that many Nigerian banks were not efficient in the first place. And if you don't have an efficient banking model and you're going to try and take on another bank, sometimes even a bank that is bigger than yours, then it makes it even more difficult. So for a number of investors and analysts, when they look at the banks that try to do the acquisition and say, okay, fine, do you have an efficient banking model that works already? If you don't, why are you trying to take on more when you can't even control what you have already? And I think that is really the big question mark a lot of people are putting on.
And then I know I said finally, but one last point. Do you think at the end of the day we'll see all these banks taken up by investors?
I think if CBN has a set timeline as to when it wants all the deals done, I don't think all the banks will follow through on that timeline. I think we might see other resolution avenues being used for some of the other institutions. I think there will be 2, 3, maybe 4 of these banks that will go through. But I think at the end of the day, the CBN is going to have to draw a line when this thing comes to a close. And those banks that were unable to find an acquisition partner, then CBN have to find other resolution methods for them.
And of course, more so because AMCON is bailing out these banks with well over, is it 2 trillion naira or thereabouts?
And there are worries that if you look at, although most rescue banks haven't come up with their results yet, there is worry that if you look at the results and you strip out and go straight down to operating income and operating expenses, these banks are not covering their operating expenses. And so there's worry about whether they're a going concern. And if they haven't got the right capital, they shouldn't really be operating. And so those are the questions that need to be asked.